Today's reading is from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 6, verses 15 through 17. Were they ashamed when they had committed abomination? No, they were not at all ashamed, nor did they know how to blush. Therefore they shall fall among those who fall. At the time I punish them, they shall be cast down, says the Lord.
Now, better? It's weird. Somebody turned this off in my back pocket. What in the world is going on in here today? Good stuff, boys. Good stuff. Y'all got me going again. Anyway, we start looking at these things that are ancient or old or whatever you want to call it. We don't always like that. And the world of religion has been that way probably since day one. And I mean that literally, Genesis 3 onward. That people can see things and then they like an innovation. Something to click. Or one of the popular terms we hear more now these days is, maybe it can resonate with the people. Folks, let me tell you something. If I hear about Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, left heaven, came to earth, lived here for over 33 years, and died, went through horrible scourging, pain, suffering, death, all for me. Just me. If I were the only person in this world, He would have done it for me. If that's not enough to convict my soul to follow the Creator, folks, then nothing ever will. I can assure you, nothing ever will, because all we're following then is whatever gimmick that's come down the pike. And we look this morning, we're going to look mostly at Jeremiah. I want to look at an old passage, really even older than what we usually do in the New Testament, looking at Jeremiah and look at issues that were going on in Jeremiah's day that we still face today in the world of religion and even often in the Lord's church. That people sometimes just don't like those old ways as much as they should. Now, with an understanding of these things going on, I want to look at something here this morning, in particular with Jeremiah we were talking about a moment ago. And they had many things that were misplaced. I don't know what happened to my print. It used to be better than that, but we'll go with it this morning. I'll read it to you. Number one, they had misplaced faith. In Jeremiah 2 and verse 13, early on in that book has 52 chapters, is actually one of the longer books of the Old Testament. And in this we have situation where Judah is the southern kingdom at this time. They are the tribe through which Jesus would one day come, and they are in danger, serious danger of losing not only their hometown, the place of God's people in Jerusalem, but losing their faith and everything else. And Jeremiah says, God says through Jeremiah this, that my people have committed two evils. First one is this, they've forsaken me, the fountain of living waters. And number two is this, they have hewn out cisterns, broken cisterns which can hold no water. Now here's the thing, spiritually speaking, he's using an illustration that folks of that day could really understand. A cistern was a place that held water. When it rained, they would have it funnel down in there, and they would have their water on that day. Now here's the thing. God says, I'm the fountain of living waters. Now here's what I would do. If I have over here a fresh fountain, clear and smooth coming up, that I can get my water from in those days, or I have over here a cistern which was usually dug out. And when water hits dirt, I don't think I have to tell you what it makes. Dirty water. Where I grew up, we had they called it a lake. Not far, and sometimes folks go down there and fish, and sometimes you could swim in there very much at your own risk, no matter where you stepped in. It wasn't very deep, and I don't really know how it got formed, but there were trees just under the water and just out of the water. And you're in there with a boat, and a little flat-bottom boat, you often got stuck on those things. And you had to rock the boat to get off those stops. One fellow described it very much this way. We pulled up, we got out, a bunch of us were going to go swimming in there, and he stopped and he said, hold on. He said, that looks like a big mud puddle. And we're going to go swimming in that? We said, sure, we got in anyway. Got in anyway. But that's what it looked like. And you don't think about that spiritually speaking. If I've got this clear water over here and I've got this dirty water over here, it's a no-brainer, right? But they did the unspeakable. They hewn, or they dug out of the earth, cisterns. And notice what he calls them, broken. No matter all the rainwater, all the water they may get in there, it's going to be bad water, and what doesn't stay is going to drain out the bottom. They're never going to get their fill. They can never slake their thirst. They're going to be dying of thirst in there and happy to do it. They're looking to be in this direction. Jesus spoke of, in particular, Pharisees, but religious leaders in John 12 and verse 43, about those who would rather please men than God. That was their goal, was to keep men in power and authority happy and not worry about what God thought. And in Jeremiah's days, he's seeing the same thing. That folks thought more about their appearance, about how they looked to others, about not offending someone who might come in and might be different, about whatever else it may be. And God's kingdom, listen to it, folks, was dissolving at an unbelievable rate because they thought more about the opinions and attitudes of mankind around them than they did about what God had already said. And in the process, you read through that amazing history of northern or the southern kingdom or the United Kingdom before that. They continually tried to keep everybody happy. Everybody except God. And that's why when I started a moment ago looking at the idea of what's going to make me a true follower of Jesus, of God, of devotion, of living my life right, is not the next great gimmick in town. It's not a circus set up in the parking lot. It's not free hot dogs on certain days or whatever else people like to do. But you know what really convicts the soul, and it always has and always will? Giving someone an understanding of God. There's enough misunderstanding of God in this world. Why can't we give them a little bit of the understanding of God, of who He is? God was reaching out through Jeremiah, not solely as a chastisement, but out of great love to them. Come back to me before you fall completely away. He says in chapter 5 and verse 15, I'm going to bring a nation against you. Now listen to his wording. We're talking about old things. An ancient nation. Chaldea, or the Babylonians as we more know them today. They're going to come against you. A language you do not know. You think about that statement. That's one of those we can read through quickly, but let's not for just a moment. In fact, when you think about that statement and what's going on, there in chapter 5 or in the book of Jeremiah, with those Babylonians coming in. I don't know their language yet. I don't know the Chaldean language as it was known then. I don't know it. And if you're in a wartime situation and someone comes in there and starts pointing a gun and saying something to you, you don't know if they're saying, get up and follow me, or I'm about to shoot you if you don't say this. Which instills more fear into the captives than anything else. They're saying something, they're angry, they're pointing a weapon at me, they're rustling chains at me, whatever they're doing, and I don't know what they're saying. God says again through Jeremiah, listen to what I'm saying. Matter of fact, when you get to chapter 5 there, in the last two verses, 30 and 31, he says, a great and horrible, terrible thing has happened in the land. He said, the prophets, they prophesy falsely. The priests, they bear rule by their own means or their own power. Now here's the bummer of it all. He goes on to say, and my people love to have it so. You talk about a difficult job. You talk about a preacher that had a tough job. It was Jeremiah. Maybe a little bit worse. I think Jeremiah was worse than Ezekiel, believe it or not. Even though God told Ezekiel, he said, you're going to go and they're going to have hard hearts and hard heads, but you're going to go preach to them anyway. Not exactly a billboard for hiring missionaries, is it? And here's Jeremiah at home. He is in Jerusalem. He is in God's city. He is around God's people. And he looks around and all he sees is people that don't want to drink from God's wonderful fountain. That are looking, it's been mentioned twice this morning, how great it is to be around each other because we're taking of God's fountain. We're getting healthy water to make us better, stronger, not just from the Word of God, but from each other, are we not? I thought so. We're helping each other. We're refreshing one another. And that's where I want to be. Amidst of those things, Judah, in the days we're looking at here, wanted nothing to do with it. They said, be gone with you. And they didn't care. And matter of fact, they were happy that the prophets were lying, the preachers of the day, basically. And the priests, prophets heard the word of God, got the word from God to man, and the priests interacted on behalf of man to God. So in both directions toward heaven, the men who stood in that place were corrupt as a whole. Now, folks, that is a terrible situation in which we could find ourselves, right? That I'm in a place where I can no longer get communication as I should from God, or that I can give back my offerings to God. And they were stuck in this. And the people, here's the thing, the fact that they loved to have it so indicates that they knew what was going on was wrong, but they liked it anyway. A sad thing to hear, is it not? Of God's people who admit they know they're doing wrong, practicing wrong, believing wrong, whatever, and say, but I'm not going to stop. I've heard that. Maybe some of you have too. To know and then to admit it, and then to admit they're not going to stop. Folks, that's a difficult thing to hear. Not just with us, but also with God. I've died for you. I've given you all these things. I've sent people to you. I've given you the gospel. I've given you salvation. I've prepared heaven for you. And you just want to have it your way? And no concern about anyone else. When those prophets lied, and those priests offered up poor and wretched sacrifices, Amos speaks a lot about that. That they would bring the worst of the flock rather than the best of the flock. God was hurt. God was put out, if you will, to say the least, that His people couldn't give Him what He deserved. And thinking about this, the title of this is we're looking at restoring that ancient faith, or reviving maybe that ancient faith. And I say restore or revive because there's always need for revival. I don't care what day, how long it's been since the last one or anything else, there's a need for it because things get cold. And things can get cold within Christianity just as well. And sometimes, believe it or not, you may not believe this, but sometimes people forget things. I've heard that. I've heard that people forget things. Even they know, and I'll never forget that. I've said that before and I forgot what I was talking about. But that's the reason for the restoration or the revival that we're seeing here. Matter of fact, as you move on here in our text, looking in at Jeremiah chapter 6, one thing that he's dealing with is how people need to understand. It was read for us this morning of the people that were not living as they should. He says, were they ashamed when they committed? Notice please, he doesn't just use the word sin, but abomination. Sin's bad enough, but abomination just describes exactly how filthy it is. The word abomination quite literally means, in about any language that I know of, to make one sick. That's a good way to describe what abomination is. But were they ashamed at all, any, when they committed abomination against God, of course? He says, no, they were not ashamed, and neither could they blush. Folks, sometimes sin can become so regular, even in God's people's lives, that they can't recognize it in front of them. So much so that, like we talked about a moment ago, those folks that know they're doing wrong and don't seem to care, sometimes folks can sin and not seem to care at all about it. Sometimes they can laugh at those of us who are spiritual and look at a situation and say, listen, brother, listen, sister, we want you to come out of that sin because God says this is how we live, not like that. And sometimes they literally laugh in your face. Try to laugh you to scorn. Like, how silly can you be? Well, I'm not silly enough to deny what God says, I know that. I'm not silly enough to look at what God's done for me and deny that. I'm not silly enough to go against God's will. And I'm certainly not silly enough to laugh at an understanding of it. And of my brother or sister who wants me to be restored, or my faith revived, or renewed, whatever word you want to say. There's a reason why we have to be born again, right? Because the old man is no good. But you know what he does when we put him in the grave? He likes to try to dig out once in a while. He likes to try to reach out of that grave. Try to get just a little taste of the old life. And a restorative faith or a reviving faith can keep it at bay. Cannot let these folks do as they would do. Matter of fact, in verse 16, Jeremiah goes on to tell him, here's what you need to do. I want you to return, he says, and see and ask for the, now listen to the wording here, old paths. There's still a gospel paper that comes out. It's been out for years called Seeking the Old Paths. We get one in the office here, and I've had a subscription to it in years past. But the principle of that is found from Jeremiah 6. And he says, I want you to stand in the way and see. Notice, please, the illustration he gives. Stand in the way of righteousness, and then see. Wherein is the good way? I want you to look for the good way. I want you to stand up long enough. It implies, number one, they're not looking, that they're not standing, and they don't care. Please get up and look and stand and look in the old paths and see these things. Understand these things that are coming toward us. See the righteousness of God. But they have made the choice not to see the righteousness of God because they said, we will not. Now there's our biblical illustration of what we've been talking about. To see and not to do. To hear and not to follow. To watch and not to understand what God says. These folks were looking in all the different directions. In Daniel chapter 7, no less than 3 times, we see the phrase, Ancient of Days. Ancient of Days. Daniel there is talking to Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. Daniel has been in captivity by this time, probably close to the 70 years already. Daniel's an old man. And he's an advisor yet again. He's worked his way back into that position, understanding several things. And there he stands in this position, still at the very end of the Babylonian regime, about to be turned over to the Medo-Persians. And he is standing there before this, and he gives these interpretations, much like his grandfather Saul, of these kingdoms that are going to come along. But he keeps referring to the Ancient of Days. So they bowed before his throne. His hair was like it was on fire. His feet were as brass. Here's the Ancient of Days, and he says, everyone will bow before him. But please notice what he is called, Ancient of Days. If I'm in a Babylonian Empire, I can look out outside of these castle walls, and I can see in various places statues. I can see a large facility over here that is full of statues of all kinds of different gods that we have stolen in our battles over the years. And he says those are not ancient. They're years, decades, maybe a century old, if that much. And they have to be remade, recast very often. But he says, when you look to the Ancient of Days, Belshazzar, you see the true God of heaven, as Daniel calls him earlier, right? The God of heaven. He makes a distinction. Those words aren't put in there incidentally, right? The God of heaven, not the God that sits on that throne, not the God that sits over there, not the God that you think you are, not the one that stands at the entranceway at the Ishtar gate, but the one who rules over and created all the materials that you can use to make your fantastic palace. The God of heaven and the Ancient of Days. Daniel's plea was a plea that we still have today. Look to the Ancient of Days. You ever heard anyone say, I'm not going to put my faith in an old book? Okay. You know, that old book is even prophesied about people like you. That old book tells us about things that happened years ago and how to handle situations that happen still today and how to get out. It still gives the best advice you're ever going to find. And that old book tells me about the Ancient of Days and about the magnificent throne upon which he sits and how he rules sovereignly over all the world and gives chance after chance after chance to even the worst people in the world, much like you, Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar, and all the other kings throughout the ages. That's what that old book tells me. That I can find the God of heaven. That I can look to the places where I need to look. I can remember, Proverbs 22 and verse 28 says that we should not remove the old or the ancient landmarks which your fathers have set. Ancient landmarks in their common nomenclature were this. They didn't have fence rows, they didn't have surveys and lasers, they didn't have those things, and they would often, if it wasn't some kind of a tree or a valley or sometimes a dry creek bed would be it, but most of the time it was piles of stones piled in a certain way. So when I saw that, I knew what it was. We have fences today and signs, keep out, no trespassing, all the different things. Well, that was theirs. This is my land. And it was taboo, especially Deuteronomy 19 speaks exclusively of this. It was a sin to remove those stones because you know what's going to happen. Some guy's coming along and he looks around. You know, there's a little bit better grass over there and I'm already fresh out. You boys move those rocks over there about 30 feet. Nobody's around. You can see for miles it's a desert, right? Nobody can see us. Let's just move those along. And that's why there was such a steep penalty for doing it. Don't remove those. But the writer there in Proverbs is using it in a different way. He's using it so we can understand spiritual boundaries. God has put His spiritual stones, ancient landmarks, using the same analogy He does, ancient landmarks in a certain place. And where these landmarks are is where they need to stay. If I come along and I look down at one of God's landmarks, one of His laws, whatever it is, and I say, okay, and fudge it over with my foot, or have somebody move it over, no one else might have seen me, but I guarantee you there is one that has. Actually, there's three that has, right? The Godhead, right? They have seen me do those things. And my removal of it doesn't remove any sin or blame from me. I've done the wrong thing. I have moved the ancient landmark. I am no longer looking to the Ancient of Days. I'm no longer trying to restore, revive, and hold up that ancient faith because it's the ancient faith that's going to save me. I can't come up with a new fad, a new religion, a new anything else. When the Hebrews writer said here in Hebrews 8 and verse 5 is what it says up there. He's talking about the tabernacle. And Hebrews 8 is, especially 7 through 13, it's just a short chapter, but much of Hebrews in general, but especially Hebrews 8, is looking to our high priest now, our one who ministers to us in the true tabernacle, in the first few verses. He's talking about Jesus, but especially when he gets to verse 5, he gives us a quote going all the way back to Exodus, talking about the tabernacle, but he's really talking about the temple today, which is God's church, His people. that we look, that we do all things, he says, according to the pattern. That word pattern is translated different ways. Pattern, sometimes just example, but the words, there's 2 or 3 different words, and all of them carry the same meaning. If I were living in that age especially, I knew exactly what it was to put a stamp down on something. I would have something here and I'd come along with a hammer and I would drive that and impress a stamp upon that. Sometimes we still do that. It's to strike or blow and leave a mark. An indelible mark. Not something that's going to wash away from that parchment as they would have. Not something that's going to wash away in time, wear away, blow away, cut away, anything else. I've stamped it on there. It's the same thing of leaving when you leave a shadow or something behind. I press something down with a stamp of ink today and I pull it back up. I've got the original here, but here's what it's left behind. And he says, this is what we do. Matter of fact, Peter says in 1 Peter 2 and verse 21 that we should follow the example of Jesus and walk in his footsteps. That word example is the same word used yet again. It's something that's been struck, blown, stamped, and is unmovable because God put it there. We're going to change the example of Jesus for us. We're going to change the pattern. What if they'd have changed the pattern of the tabernacle? Later on, change the pattern of the temple. All those commands, this on top of this and this over here, this kind of fabric, this gold overlaid, this solid gold, this over here. That's just too much work. We can't do that. The text he says in Hebrews 5 is referring to that very thing, really the tabernacle before that we do what God says. Folks, that's restoring. That is reviving. And that is simply doing God's will. Listening to what he says. Understanding the Ancient of Days and the Ancient of Ways. And yes, following that old book. Because that old book is giving us all that we need for life and salvation. That old book is giving us all the knowledge we have. We could not know a single thing about God without this book. I know Psalm 19 says that we can see his handiwork, but we wouldn't know to whom to ascribe it, would we? Without God's book. Wouldn't know a thing about Jesus Christ without this book. We know nothing about heaven or salvation without looking to the Ancient of Days or the Ancient of his ways. And folks, it's good to look to the old in this instance. To look at what God has inscribed. To look at what he has blown, struck with that hammer. Look at what he has put down. And to have that understanding of God following us, loving us, and caring for us, that I can do enough to look back and restore that ancient faith, folks. That I can hang on to it. That I can see what he has given me, that it's right and it's profound. And that mankind can speak just as they did in the days of Jeremiah. That they can lie, they can cheat, they can steal, they can do all the things that they did and they still do. But the Ancient of Days does not. Listen to me. The Ancient of Days still calls out to his people. He still calls out to the entirety of the world to hear me, to listen to what I have to say, to obey me. Here's what I've done for you. Here's what I want to continue to do for you. And here's where I want you to reside forever. And it's called heaven. Let's restore that ancient faith, folks, if we haven't. Let's restore our faith in the ancient and follow him all his days. Do his will. Folks, I can obey the gospel of Jesus Christ that he's given us for almost 2,000 years now, and it is still as fresh and as invigorating and most of all life-saving as it was when it was rolled off the lips of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, the Bible still says in Hebrews 13, is the same yesterday, today, and forever, doesn't it? And so is his word. You can obey the gospel, or maybe you have, but a fallen way, folks, don't do that. If your faith needs to be restored, let's do that. Let's get together this morning. We can pray for you, pray with you, and God will restore you and your faith and keep on going through this life. If you have need now this morning, why don't you come while we stand and while we sing?